Koitalel Arap Samoei was a leader whose name carried both law and lightning across the high grasslands of Nandi. In the first years of the 20th century, as the British Empire pushed rail lines and settlers into Kenya's Rift Valley, Koitalel stood at the center of a 10-year resistance that colonial officials came to call the Nandi Rebellion. He was not only a war leader, but the Orkoyot, the spiritual guide whose words shaped the courage and strategy of his people. To the British, he was an obstacle to pacification. To the Nandi, he was the guarantor of their land and law. This is the story of a parley that was never meant to end honorably, and of a conspiracy whose consequence was the breakdown of a society. By 1905, the East Africa Protectorate had seen years of raids, punitive expeditions, and increasing pressure to open Nandi country for settlers and railway construction. Koitalel's resistance had inflicted defeats and frustrated colonial officers. The administration concluded that eliminating him was the only way to secure control. The plan was surgical in its duplicity. British officers extended the language of diplomacy, invitations, assurances of safety, the trappings of negotiation, knowing full well that those rules did not apply to the colonized. Records and later investigations make clear what happened. Koitalel agreed to meet under a flag of supposed truce. He came, surrounded by a small retinue, and hoped that his reputation for fair bargains would be honored. The man who greeted him was Captain Richard Meinertzhagen, a young officer whose later memoirs would braid fact and fantasy. What Meinertzhagen later wrote and what other witnesses reported were at odds. The official British account framed the killing as an act of self-defense. Koitalel had allegedly drawn a concealed weapon or attempted an ambush, but Nandi testimony and subsequent historical scrutiny tell a different story. The meeting was a setup. Koitalel was shot while negotiating, struck down in front of his followers. The exhilaration of victory for the colonial project was instant, and the grief for Nandi irreversible. When Koitalel fell, the structures he anchored collapsed. Without their spiritual leader and strategist, the Nandi were rapidly subdued. Land was confiscated, grazing patterns disrupted, and the colonial state expanded taxation and labor demands. The railway and settler farms that Koitalel had fought to keep at bay pushed in. What the British called pacification was in practice a violent remaking of daily life, fashioned by a single act of treachery. The killing also produced its own bureaucratic cover-up. Reports were rewritten, claims of self-defense reiterated, and the narrative of a necessary, lawful removal of a dangerous rebel calcified into official record. Meinertzhagen's own retelling, elaborated in private papers and later publicized memoirs, would become a source of pride among some contemporaries. Only decades later would historians and critics examine his papers and find exaggerations and possible fabrications, another layer of deception added to the original crime. For the Nandi, the memory did not fade. Tales of the betrayal passed down in oral memory preserved the truth of that morning. A leader invited to speak and then shot. A community betrayed by the language of peace. The death of Koitalel did what no single column of soldiers could. It erased the moral cohesion of resistance and enabled a sweeping transformation of life in Nandi territories. This incident is not an isolated colonial anecdote, but a pattern. Across Africa during the first half of the 20th century, imperial power frequently blended diplomacy and duplicity. Parleys could be traps, treaties could be pretexts. The killing of Koitalel is a stark, historically documented instance where the law of empires overrode the law of nations and conscience. In recent decades, Kenyans and historians have reclaimed Koitalel's story. Memorials and retellings present him as both the state builder and martyr, a man who upheld his people's law against an empire that chose murder over negotiation. The conspiracy that ended him was simple and brutal. Use the rituals of trust to extinguish the person who embodied resistance, then rewrite the record to hide the violence. Koitalel's death in 1905 did not only end an uprising, it revealed how conquest was achieved, not merely by armies, but by calculated betrayal.